In the latest scheme to get ahead of voter fraud that isn't happening, GOP voters are waiting to vote until the last possible minute. I'm Yasmin Khan with The Breakdown, and if that strategy doesn't make any sense to you, it's because it doesn't make any sense. It's a dumb solution to a non-existent problem, and that's it. You can't solve a problem that isn't a problem, but they're sure going to try and be super annoying about it while they're doing it. Now, the logic, if you want to call it that, behind the scheme is that by voting late on election day, which would involve willingly waiting in long voting lines and making poll workers stay much later than they'd otherwise need to, voters are narrowing the time frame in which hackers would be able to hack. The idea is that if GOP voters vote early, they show their hand. If Democrats see how much support the GOP has, they'll do more to hack the election, and they'll have more time to do it.
You start doing ballots like this.
This way, in the words of one GOP candidate, quote, if there were to be any funny business, they would have the least amount of time to do said funny business. But if a hacker was hacking an electronic system by way of an algorithm, can't they just set the algorithm ahead of time? What difference would it make how late the votes come in? So if you'll recall, the 2020 election, according to the GOP narrative, was stolen from Trump by way of faulty voting machines that were changing votes for Trump to votes for Biden, something that no one has since been able to prove. There was also, according to the GOP narrative, tons of fake mail-in votes that came in for Biden, while very few, suspiciously, came in for Trump. And this had nothing to do with the fact that Trump had just spent months telling his base not to vote by mail, again, according to the GOP narrative. But to understand this particular voting late scheme, a piece in the Washington Post reminds us of a quote from Trump's attorney, Sidney Powell. Back in 2020, she said that the voting machine hacks were something they, quote, might never have uncovered had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm that had been plugged into the system. And that's what caused them to have shut down in the states they shut down in. In other words, Trump got so many votes that his supporters broke the algorithm, which is in itself a nonsensical statement made by and believed by people who I'm guessing are not software engineers. Still, however nonsensical, Trump supporters, as we've seen, have bought the lie, and 2 years later, their belief in the unproven is still motivating their feelings of injustice, oppression, and discrimination. So a few things going on here. First, there's an unidentifiable them, in this case, the hackers. No one knows who they are, what they do, or how they do it, but they're the enemy that we should all be afraid of. They're like the men in black, no names and no fingerprints. These hackers do a job that very, very few people actually understand, regardless of how many times they may have watched Mr. Robot. So it's easy for normal, non-hacker people to assume whatever it is they want to about that group. They can assume what a hacker is capable of without needing to understand the mechanisms behind their assumptions. The mere existence of hackers is prime fodder for fear-mongering because people fear that which they don't understand, and of course, we all know that fear is one of the most effective tools when it comes to driving action from people. But all of that aside, looking past how ridiculous this plot is, looking past how annoying and inconvenient it's going to be on election night, and looking past how ridiculous people are for believing something without ever seeing any supporting evidence, it's a tough bridge to cross for democracy. There was once a belief among democratic nations, including this one, that only certain classes or groups of people should be allowed to vote. And yes, some of that was rooted in elitism, racism, misogyny, etc., but some of it was based on the belief that only people who knew what was up should be allowed to have a say in how things were run. In other words, people who were educated, or maybe people who had experience as business owners or were notable members of society. Of course, in a truly democratic society, this is problematic because it's not really a democracy. It's still a group of people making decisions for a populace, while the populace has little to no say in the matter. Instead, we created a system of representative government, a system that was designed to give us the best of both worlds. The people would be able to choose their representative, and the representative, who is presumably highly qualified for the role and who is presumably intimately connected with the will and values of their constituents, would make educated and just decisions on their behalf. Today, the system doesn't quite work like that, and maybe it never has. But as another election day looms, the American people who fall for scams like the big lie and participate in schemes like the one we're talking about today, they're the ones who have been duped by and lied to by the people they trust, the people they believe, however naively, have their best interest at heart. A voter is only as good as the information they're given, and between increasingly partisan politicians, highly partisan media, and just social media overall, it's wild out there. You almost can't blame people for losing their footing a bit. Various systems and public figures, either in the media or in government, have deliberately made it difficult for voters to discern what's real and what isn't, what's truth and what's propaganda, what or who can be trusted, and what or who should not be trusted. These politicians specifically have called reality itself into question, imploring blind faith and belief in the unseen, the unheard, and the unproven, somehow convincing an entire voter base that ignorance is preferable to discomfort, and in so doing, they've managed to damage the very democracy they're fighting for a place within. And as we talked about earlier, fear is a strong motivator, but it's also a strong vulnerability. Those fears, those vulnerabilities were planted within a voting populace so that they could be manipulated and exploited. And that's what we're seeing today. Frankly, it's disrespectful to Americans and it's disrespectful to democracy. All right, that is it for me. If you got something out of this, please like and subscribe and be sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you very much.